I'd like to begin this video with a question. Have you ever really gotten into a series, whether it's video games, collection of books, or a series of films? You've experienced the highest peaks in that series, the critical darling, the entry that really put it on the map, and then you've wondered to yourself, where does it go from here? It can be quite polarizing to see an experience and see it take a tonal shift from what really put its name on the map and what really made it this big juggernaut of a series. One easy example that I can think of here is Attack on Titan, where many of the pre-established conceptions and overall central themes that define that show and made it so popular to begin with really do deviate in the later seasons, and they pull into a different direction that many who would have got hooked with the show might not enjoy as much. For me, Final Fantasy VIII really is that in video game form. After the critical success that came with Final Fantasy VII, the flexibility of materia, the fast-paced action story that really kicks off from the get-go, Final Fantasy VIII really is tonally a different game. It starts off slower, it has a much more complex and I would say deeper system that is a bit hard to navigate, but it's a game that in a weird way has a lot of beauty to it. It has its inescapable flaws, but underneath that is a game that if you can really look past the success and how much of an antithesis it is to its predecessor, Final Fantasy VIII is a really interesting game to look at. This is going to be an interesting video for me because Final Fantasy VIII is one of these games that I have this weird relationship with since finishing it. I've, throughout my playthrough, had these moments where I was like, do I like this game? And I really found parts of it annoying, and then at other times I was like, man, I love this game. It may not be my favorite entry in the series, and at times it can be a little frustrating, but there is something so beautiful about Final Fantasy VIII that I just am going to try and work through and understand in this video and hopefully explain to you. Without further ado, I'd really like to just kick off my video for Final Fantasy VIII and why I consider it to be somewhat misunderstood, miscategorized, and overall an understandably polarizing game. So before I dive into the heart of this video, I feel like it's important to answer and talk about the biggest question and elephant in the room when discussing Final Fantasy VIII. And to me, that question is, why is this such a polarizing experience and in many ways a misunderstood one? An immediate observation is this inescapable fate that Final Fantasy VIII suffers from, where it deviates from the winning formula established with Final Fantasy VI and more notably Final Fantasy VII. In a video I made previously in the past for Final Fantasy VII, I talked about the monumental weight and influence that FF7 carried with it. And with Final Fantasy VIII, it had the task of following up that game. And it was one of the juggernauts of the PS1 era. Like, it was hard to compete with what Final Fantasy VII really did for video games at the time. And it really is crazy. Square's approach to Final Fantasy VIII feels like the adverse direction in terms of approach to the way that 7 really unfolded. It's everything from how the story unfolds, how rapid and quick Final Fantasy VII gets into the action compared to Final Fantasy VIII, the pacing, and more notably, the game systems that 8 introduced. Final Fantasy VIII is one that can be enjoyed when you accept it and play it on its own terms. It has a much more slower pace and is crafting this world of conflict that is full of implications of what that said conflict is. It doesn't immediately become apparent or available until the midway point. Its overarching story doesn't even really unfold until about 5 to 10 hours into the game. It is a game that is structured in a way that feels dreamlike and purposefully leaves out details, and later those details do allude to a particular conclusion, but some of them really do in many ways leave it up to your imagination. Some may love this, others may not. This is one aspect of Final Fantasy VIII that I find both frustrating and weirdly charming. It's so weird. I love seeing many of the conclusions that many different fans of this series have discussed over the years, but at the same time, I do feel like some of the twists and turns and some of the explanations do feel a little cheap and contrived. It is easy to see why this is one of those games that is really, you'll either love it or hate it. This rings doubly true when you look at it through the lens that Final Fantasy VIII in many ways does feel like the antithesis of 7. It is a much more slow-paced story that takes hours to unfold, a much more robust yet convoluted junction system, and a resource management style system with how spells are drawn and casted opposed to just traditionally learning spells and having them in your range of abilities that you can just cast that are tied to things like mana or MP. It was no wonder why people weren't a fan of this game back in '99, and it did develop a cult-like status and people who did love it, because there were many things here, and I would still say and argue that this is Square at their most experimental. It is something that is brought up with every video whenever people talk about Final Fantasy and a particular release. We all know that Square Enix love to change up the formulas for how they use their gameplay systems, how they tell stories with each Final Fantasy game. So it was no wonder that they were looking for a new direction to go after 7, but I think that the way 8 was done and the direction they took, it being so drastically different to 7, really is something that I think would have turned off a lot of people. But that's not to say that Final Fantasy VIII doesn't have its fair share of action, doesn't have its wealth of side activities, doesn't have a system that does feel rewarding and with its progression. It has all the similar types of trappings that many other Final Fantasy games that came before it had. But I would say that you didn't see the fruits of these systems really pay off until you got more hours and experience with the game. And I think that that is the biggest thing here, especially when in comparison to 7, where the turnaround is a lot more immediate and you really get a feel for its gameplay, and it being the first one to really do this whole 3D action thing really did set it apart from its predecessors compared to 8, who had that game to follow up. Overall, I think time has been very friendly to Final Fantasy VIII. I think that it's a game that in 1999 people just wanted more of 7, and when 8 came out it was a very different game, as I mentioned, experimental in nature. But here in 2024, I think it is a game that can be a lot more appreciated given the fact that we've seen many JRPGs and turn-based RPGs release, and I think that with that fatigue, Final Fantasy VIII does offer something to this day that is still wholly unique and very different to many other Final Fantasy games, but more broadly, many other JRPGs on the market. It is a game that still does come with its myriad of issues. One that I can just say that I'm still not very fond of is the drawing system, and that being an alternative for leveling. It is something that's interesting, and I think fine-tuned, if it ever got a remake or proper remaster, would see it be able to thrive, but it is a game that I think, despite its flaws, is misunderstood in many ways, and it is scaring a lot of people off from giving it a chance given the history that it garnered back in 1999. But I'm here to tell you, right now, you really should take a chance on Final Fantasy VIII, especially if you are a fan of turn-based RPGs. Now I'd like to briefly touch on the development of Final Fantasy VIII, which began in 1997 when Final Fantasy VII was going through its translation stage. It was said by Yoshinori Kitase that since the early stages of development, the core principles and objective of Final Fantasy VIII was to tell a story that revolved around its main characters, Squall and Rinoa. The individual character arcs of the side characters in the party that was established in the previous entries took a back seat here in Final Fantasy VIII, and it was to be set center stage around FF8's hero and heroine. And with that in mind, we would see the iconic dance scene being a suggestion by Nomura to introduce these two characters to one another, and the love story that was the core driver in motion. As you'll notice throughout this segment discussing development, it's worth mentioning that Final Fantasy VIII was a game that was left in full control of Kitase, as Hironobu Sakaguchi was working as executive producer at the time on the upcoming Final Fantasy The Spirits Within film. There was also changes made to improve communication between Square's localization teams in both Japan and the US, following the turbulent development release of Final Fantasy VII and that rough initial translation. It's also worth mentioning early on that Nomura had an idea for the conclusion thought for both the stories of Squall and Laguna and how they could connect to one another, but it was later dropped and ultimately altered to what we have in the final game. It's worth mentioning that Nomura also proposed the concept of the gardens and academies to provide a brighter introduction to the world, opposed to the dark and bleaker introduction of the locales of FF7's sector slums. At the same time, he didn't want the school segments to require the player to take on mundane tasks and wanted to preserve the fantasy aspect of the game, providing the player with a futuristic looking locale and vehicles, and would also be the concept for many of the missions that would kick off at the start of the game. The parade scene from early on in the early stages of development was emphasized as one of the most pivotal scenes where the antagonist would make their appearance known, and Kitase stated it was, from its conception, meant to serve as an important moment to the story. Katase's reasons for believing this is due to the idea that the player's excitement and engagement with the story would be heavily influenced by how this scene landed and was perceived by the player. This is definitely a point and sentiment that I feel still holds a lot of merit to this day, as this scene in particular really does set both the stage and the tone for the story going forward, and depending on how this directional shift makes you feel will determine more or less how you probably will end up feeling later on with this game. There's two moments for me personally that I feel have this directional shift in pivot in the story that I think can either turn the player off from the narrative or really get them more engaged, but I think I'll discuss that more later. The story for Final Fantasy VIII is an interesting one. Like I discussed earlier in this video, and it'll be a continued point that underpins this video, it is that this game has a much slower start and setting compared to its predecessor. Final Fantasy VIII kicks off placing you in the shoes of Squall, a member of a militia of soldiers called Seed, and him and his comrades, his fellow Seeds, initially take on missions similar to mercenaries who just lend their services to people willing to pay and help. As I mentioned in the development section, the true nature of Final Fantasy VIII begins to take form when the team is tasked with taking on a mission to assassinate a sorceress, the parade scene. So now, before diving into the themes, I want to talk about Final Fantasy VIII and how it handles some of the more bigger moments, reveals, and characters. And in doing so, I will be discussing spoilers. So if you are someone who hasn't played this yet and is wanting to, I'm leaving a timestamp below. You can skip ahead or come back when you've played the game. The first big spoiler that I'm going to talk about is the most contentious one amongst fans, and one that didn't really gel with me either, and that comes at the end of Disc 2, and that is the memory loss sequence. Honestly, I don't think in concept that this twist was bad, but the execution, much like many moments in Final Fantasy VIII, feels muddled and mishandled, and in many ways the twist ends up feeling more contrived than something that was the writing on the wall the whole time. I feel like the art of a good reveal really is being able to notice it in retrospect. I'm going to use, again, Final Fantasy VII as an example. The twist with Cloud, I think, is so good because when you play it back in retrospect, you can see it kind of on the wall. You can start to get that something is not right with this character. And when the reveal comes, it isn't really hard to piece it all together or believe that that happened. However, the Guardian Forces twist here and the fact that that altered these characters' memories, there is nothing really that alludes to this. I mean, there is light references, but nothing, it isn't a big variable that is at play throughout the story. And I mean, in retrospect, you can pick up on some things, but it's never really done in a way that feels as well crafted as many other twists and turns that we've seen in other games. And I think that here it just ends up feeling a lot more contrived and a lot more like they needed to have a reason to tie all these characters together than have that meaningful twist play out and be a key part of that story. Next, I'd like to discuss the party members and many of the supporting characters in this game, because I do feel many of the party members here are hit or miss for me personally, and some of these characters are key to how receptive you are to the story beats of Final Fantasy VIII. The two main characters that are the focus and will dictate your enjoyment are, of course, the game's protagonist Squall, and then there is Rinoa, who is the love interest of this story, and also the heroine. Sadly, outside of these two central characters, I feel like the other party members really don't get much of an arc and end up feeling more like the change they undergo is something of an afterthought or minimal. The real weak point for me here is because a lot of the compelling Final Fantasy games, I think of Final Fantasy VI, 7, and hell, even 10 and 13, had this cast of characters that I feel undergo some sort of arc and really are like, you get this sense of a full party and the characters all growing. But here in 8, it doesn't really get that same development. I mean, sure, they have some sense of change, but it never is like on the same degree and doesn't feel like a party-based story. It feels more like a love story between two characters instead of a party of full characters, like a whole group where they all change, all grow, and all work together. Thankfully, Final Fantasy VIII makes up for this with one of its best characters, and that is the living Chad himself, Laguna. Whilst these dream sequences on a first playthrough can feel like they interrupt the narrative pacing of Final Fantasy VIII, it does eventually click into place, and through subsequent playthroughs can feel more meaningful, looking through this retrospective lens. Also, Laguna's theme is a bop. Despite these narrative gripes that I have with the game, I do believe that Final Fantasy VIII serves a wealth of substance in its storytelling, the deeper meaning, and the characters and themes that the game does choose to focus on, and it ultimately works in the game's favor. And if you can really get into this and give it a chance, stick with it, I'm sure there'll be something meaningful there that you find. So the first theme that we'll be discussing is one of the underlining themes in Final Fantasy VIII, and many RPGs for that matter, and that's how it handles the concept of fate. It is no surprise to anyone who has played Final Fantasy VIII that, especially from Disc 3 onwards, the game really starts to take full force in the concepts of time, with Ultimecia's ultimate plan and goal being time compression. But where this ending for Final Fantasy VIII to me really does fully start to paint the picture is in the final moments of the story, when everything comes full circle, creating a paradox, with its ending where Squall finds himself in the past having a conversation with Ada and is the origin of how she becomes the sorceress. It feels like many JRPGs try to tackle the concept and notion of fate, and it has often led to our protagonists felling a deity or determining their own fate. And don't get me wrong, Final Fantasy VIII on its surface does have this, and it is at the forefront for the main cast wanting to change the future and defeat the sorceress. But upon a more closer inspection, you can see how Final Fantasy VIII's story tells a story that explores the acceptance and embrace of fate through the concept of predestination. But also, one finds free will and transcends their fate through love and through working with the people they care for. There is often this interesting discussion that I have with a friend of mine when talking about the concept of fate, and I often think that an individual can have a moment where they have the free will to act, but if there is some higher power or construct at play, that they ultimately know the outcome, but the individual is able to still react within that moment in time. And I think that Final Fantasy VIII paradoxically skirts that line between the free will of the individual and what is set in stone and determined, like written. Throughout the story, and especially towards its ending, it shows how the story of Final Fantasy VIII is a closed loop paradox of the events, meaning Squall himself is predetermined to go and communicate to Ada and say what's needed to be done for the sake of the future. However, it is through this act of love where Squall and Rinoa are able to act freely and find one another in the ending scene of the game. It is decided and destined that Squall and his comrades will fight Ultimecia, but at the same time will also lead Ultimecia back in time to possess Ada and cause the events of Final Fantasy VIII to unfold as they are. It's a closed time loop that intertwines cleverly and asks you, can free will exist in the embrace of fate? And it answers that question with love and the act of reuniting with our companions. One of the core themes that Final Fantasy VIII bases itself around and early on serves as the story's core focus is this geopolitical conflict between Balamb and Galbadia. The story asserts this early on, with Squall and his comrades being the latest additions to SEED, a student military that has been dispatched as a special task force to undergo various tasks that serve the allies of Balamb. Squall is appointed the leader of this team, and many have complained about Squall's down-on demeanor, referring to him as an edgy character and things of that nature. But I think, as you see the story unfold, it depicts the feelings of doubt, uncertainty, and these moments where he infamously says whatever. These are just moments where he's very standoffish as a character. And I think that there's also a kind of issue here with the translations, where I don't think that was originally what was conveyed in the Japanese translation compared to what we got with our English translation. So I think Squall's character very much is supposed to be someone who is just trying to keep himself away from people and isolates himself so he can prevent these underlying feelings of grief and trauma and ultimately loneliness when these people either go away. And it all stems back from his time at the orphanage. When you take all these variables and put them all together, it really does paint a vivid picture as to why Squall's character is the way that he is. I can understand the more edgy like facade of his character just saying whatever and being very shrugging everything off and distancing himself from people, but it's a thing that you kind of notice as you stick through the story, and it's more of a mechanism that he uses to protect himself. Another interesting side note that I feel was intentionally placed in this game, and it is how the story of FF8 contrasts between Squall and Laguna. So from how their characters develop as people and the company that they keep as well. You've got one party here being Squalls, and it's a bunch of teen mercenaries who are inexperienced and trying to figure out their way as Seeds. And then you've got Laguna's party, this experienced set of veteran soldiers out on an adventure. It really does showcase throughout Laguna's story in particular that Laguna's duty as a soldier prevented him from pursuing his love and ultimately caused him to have a set of issues that happened and caused him to even miss the birth of his own own child and the passing of the person that he loved. To peel back through another layer of this, the game does indirectly imply that the baby that Rain gave birth to was also Squall, and if we do agree on this, it would leave Squall ultimately as a casualty in this sense. And on top of that, it would be this sense of generational grief that is passed down from the father to the son, and these types of feelings of loneliness that are like, and grief that trickle down and have a ripple effect on people. And I think that that is something that also is an apparent theme that is present throughout Final Fantasy VIII. And another interesting thing that I think brings all of these different themes together is transcendence. I think ultimately, whether you look at the themes of fate, destiny, or the themes of grief, trauma, or ultimately love, the core theme of this game, you will see that it is all about how these emotions can transcend through time and pass down or work around the notion of time. Lastly is the one central theme that I feel many take away from Final Fantasy VIII, and that is the underlining theme of love and the love story that forms throughout this story, but more importantly, the exploration of relationships. There are many different relationships that are explored throughout the story of Final Fantasy VIII, whether it's the headmaster Cid and Ada, whether it is Laguna's original infatuation with Julia and his eventual relationship with Rain. Hell, Rinoa early on in the story talks about Cypher in a way that implies she loves him before, and as we all know, it leads to the central relationship that accentuates the theme of love, which is her relationship with Squall. I think the way Final Fantasy VIII tackles love can in many ways feel like it comes out of nowhere, and to me the first time around I really felt that, but the theme of love is at its core of this experience, and it is at that core, and is delivered and examined through the previous themes of trauma, grief that we explored prior. And what I mean by this is Final Fantasy VIII explores relationships in many different ways and through many different characters, particularly in romantic relationships, but it isn't exclusively told through romances of perseverance of those relationships, but also often a tale of relationships that have broken down, fallen apart, or never been able to be expressed. It is this somber and shattering angle of love, and a more grounded depiction that not everything works out. And on the flip side, especially from Disc 3 onwards, it is this notion and these ideas of these failed relationships that really make you want to root for Squall and Rinoa's relationship to really succeed. Most of Final Fantasies have this undertone of perseverance, where Final Fantasies VII, for example, is centered around identity and overcoming the doubt in the mind, where I think Final Fantasy VIII's form of perseverance is focused around love, and how love, as I said, transcends all. It can be seen through how Rain is still loved and remembered by Laguna. It can be seen through Ada's love for her orphan children, and ultimately it can be seen through Squall traversing time periods to save the one that he loves. I think at its core that Final Fantasy VIII really does tell a story of love, but more ultimately transcendence and what one is willing to do for those they care for, how they're able to put aside their grief, trauma, and hardships and let people in, and when letting in those people you love, you are able to accomplish and transcend those obstacles that may otherwise seem impossible to overcome. I think that's the beauty of Final Fantasy VIII. There is something messy in its storytelling. It fumbles here and there, but I think that thematically it does have a lot of meaningful substance, and I think on a replay you really can get a lot of that meaning and see a lot of these things that might have come across a little jarring or out of left field the first time, but looking from a different lens really do hit differently the second time around. And I have nothing but appreciation for the attempts that the team have tried to make with this type of story and storytelling that they executed with this game. So now I'd like to dive into the combat for Final Fantasy VIII, which has a very interesting and unique system compared to many other RPGs, and honestly I feel like with Final Fantasy VIII this is Square at their most experimental. So here in Final Fantasy VIII you have your regular attacks and magic and works like clockwork. However, the way that magic is called upon here in Final Fantasy VIII is it's used and consumed sort of like a resource. So in other Final Fantasy games we usually acquire our abilities through rolls, equipable items like materia, or unlocks like the sphere grid where you have a skill to master. This allows the party members to be proficient in different facets of different jobs, and you can kind of have a flexibility in how you want to like spec different characters. Here in Final Fantasy VIII the approach is much different, where the way to obtain abilities has been adopted into a more resource management formula, where any party member can use any particular skill if they are able to extract it from an enemy using a skill that every party member has known as a draw. Drawing feels like a great mechanic on paper, and it does make moments where you encounter a new enemy feel fruitful, with it being a lucky dip on what new abilities you can acquire. However, it is the acquisition of these abilities, how drawn out it becomes, and also how the draw mechanic and you stock your spells interlocks with the overarching junction system, which we'll get into in the next section of this video. So with all that in mind and the resource economy of your abilities, it replaces the use of things like MP, but instead makes every spell feel finite. So I guess the question now is, when do I use these abilities, and do I save these abilities for this enemy? And it's crazy because it feels like in many ways Final Fantasy VIII feels unrestrictive in what it allows you to hold in terms of abilities. However, it ends up making you become a hoarder of particular abilities for a multitude of reasons, and the unpredictability of knowing what you'll get and when you'll get this ability again and how hard some spells are to come by makes you want to hoard different abilities. And it doesn't help that the resources and these abilities can be equipped to how you level up your character, i.e. through that junction system, and how much drawing spells also plays into your overall level and damage you do and different statistics in that junction system. But overall, I do respect the fact and appreciate them trying something different, but for me personally, I really don't feel like the way that the draw system really was executed and was the best system, really. I don't think that it really worked out. I think there's a lot of merit to ideas that it has, but there was a lot of issues that came along with it too. And if you think I'm done with my complaints about drawing, wait until we get to junctioning, because there is another major reason that is tied to junctions as to why I don't think drawing works. Another mechanic that was introduced in Final Fantasy VIII is how it handles the idea of summons, which are referred to as guardian forces. This mechanic allows you to call out various different summons that you'll acquire throughout your journey, and they'll have their own health number along with a timer until they attack your enemy. What I think is cool about guardian forces in Final Fantasy VIII is how you acquire many of these different guardian forces. So a lot of the time it'll tie to a draw mechanic. And you'll be fighting various bosses and big bosses throughout the story. And if you check to draw from them, you can acquire a boss, a summon, just like acquiring a Pokemon or acquiring some rare item. It's crazy. It was a really cool idea that made checking, and a part of the draw mechanic that I did like, it made checking that draw feature regularly, even on bosses, feel worthwhile. Like you could get rewarded something cool. There's always something out there that was interesting, and that's one aspect that I did like with drawing, and I did like that aspect of how you acquire summons in this game. Also, you can fight the summons as well sometimes. You'll find them and they'll just come out and you'll have a boss battle. And that's another cool thing that I like with Guardian Forces. It feels in a weird way sort of like a precursor to what you would see in later Final Fantasies, where we would see you fight summons in 16, 7 Remake, and even 14. I guess like 8 was doing that stuff, and it's pretty cool. I liked it. There have been many different systems and iterations within Final Fantasy as to how we build our party members. Whether it is a set class, the job system, sphere grids, or gambits, there is tons of different frameworks that Square has crafted over the years to deliver a fresh take on the progression and build crafting of the Final Fantasy experience, but none feel as ambitious conceptually as the junction system that was introduced in Final Fantasy VIII. It's a system that takes the various attributes that you draw throughout your travels that I mentioned earlier and has the player assigning that particular ability to a particular stat that each character has. This can be something like HP, Vitality, Luck, and the like. Applying different abilities such as Cure and Suna to HP will likely increase your party members' HP. Unlike other RPGs in the Final Fantasy series where you would prescribe a certain amount of skill points to HP or have a certain equipment that would bolster your HP, something of that nature. The next big catch is, and this really caught me off guard the first time playing Final Fantasy VIII, is how it handles leveling. So in most RPGs and Final Fantasy games, you'll want to fight and defeat every enemy you face, and naturally you level up and progress alongside the game. Maybe you grind an extra level or two here and there so you can fight the upcoming boss with ease. Well, in Final Fantasy VIII it works differently here. The way you become overpowered lies more in the abilities that you draw from enemies and the abilities that are pulled from triple triad cards, meaning seasoned players will find ways with this game to break it early on, and they can get crazy levels and they can make the game easy, become super overpowered. But if you're someone like me or the normal average RPG person and you try to approach this game in the traditional sense, well, your efforts are futile in a sense, because in Final Fantasy VIII, the enemies that you face aren't relegated to a particular level for a particular area they appear in or the period in the game that you encounter them. More, they appear anywhere within a particular level bracket, and the enemies you face throughout the game scale alongside the player, making grinding your worst enemy. The main two components that function in tandem with one another in Final Fantasy VIII is the draw system and the different abilities that you can draw that are junctioned to your various stats. This also complicates things because, as I mentioned in the section earlier discussing the draw mechanics, every ability in Final Fantasy VIII is a resource, meaning that you can draw up to 100 of every ability that enemy carries, and then junctioning that ability to a particular stat. The higher the stack of that spell that you have stored, the bigger the boost of that particular stat. So it's great, and in a sense of wonder, whenever you're fighting the enemy you face, you'll be there going, what can I encounter? That lucky dip moment that I was talking about. But the downside is that it also comes at the detriment of the junctioned stats that you have. So let's take that analogy that I used earlier about cure. If I have 100 cures and that increases my health like exponentially, let's say I run into a difficult boss and I need to use about 10 of those heals or even 15. That would lower my overall health and I'd have to go and farm some enemies, so I'd still be doing some grinding, but just in a different sense where I'm just drawing their abilities to just get the cure to level back up. I understand this like little rabbit hole, and I understand that there's a lot of little statistical areas that you can go down and some crazy builds that you can make here in Final Fantasy VIII. And I think it's great in one respect, but it also really does at the same time feel like this system really does hinder itself with the draw mechanic, which holds it back. I don't think that the junction system conceptually is a bad idea though, and I do think there's a lot of charm in the level of flexibility that it offers the player, and the way that it allows for a lot of customization and builds, and the way that it allows people to actually break the game and make themselves overpowered early on if they know what they're doing. It is incredible, and I don't think that mastering the system is a necessity to enjoy the game, but I think to get the full effect of Final Fantasy VIII, which I'll loop back to a point I made earlier, you really have to accept and play it on its terms. And that means you have to really wrestle with and come to terms with both the draw system and the junction system. I personally feel like whilst it isn't my favorite system or method of leveling and progressing characters, I do have respect for the junction system. It provides a level of flexibility that I don't think I've seen really in many other RPGs, and it does allow these skilled enough players to really break the game. And in many ways, it feels like it took the inverse approach again to a system like the materia system in 7. I really do think that this level of complexity and the builds that you can make here in 8 are incredible, but I think that the hindrance that comes and really weighs down the system is how drawing is such a reliant factor, and how that also conflicts with the combat as well. These things, I think overall, if we ever did get a remake, could be addressed, and junctioning could actually be one of the best systems we've seen in a Final Fantasy, but here I am dreaming, but we'll get to that in a bit. Now I'd like to dive into the overall sound and visual presentation for Final Fantasy VIII. And overall, this is a step up and a clear testament to how much of a juggernaut that Square were at this point in time, delivering stellar cinematics, a captivating soundtrack that would capture the mood of every locale and place that you visited. In this department, Final Fantasy VIII was an undeniable step forward for both the series and video games. With all of that said about the game, I would also like to preface that for my first playthrough, I was playing the remastered version of the game, which provided more detailed facial models, as well as a visual uplift and the convenience of some other features like 3x speed, as well as like turning off random encounters, all those little bells and whistles. So I did get to play a more refined, proper visual looking version of the game with no MIDI files and sounds and stuff like that for the OST either, thank God. But with all of that in mind, even though playing that version, the FMV like videos and the visuals that were there, the musical score, all of these things still remain intact and still are a product of that original title that released back in '99. So yeah, everything I said still stands. Now I'd like to talk about the visuals and the influences and a few things that you'd see in this game, because there was a clear sci-fi influence that was pulled from this when you look at things like the gardens, but they also pull like interesting kind of like architectural influences from like Europe, and it's heavily contrasted really well with like futuristic cityscapes like Esther, which was such an insane revelation by the way. But the world of Final Fantasy VIII is incredible, and the size and scale of this game was really crazy too. The soundtrack, man, it further excels, showing the excellence of Nobuo Uematsu as a musical composer, with a large variety of tracks that shine. And the first song in the Final Fantasy game to contain lyrics, which was Eyes on Me, which played during one of the game's peaks in Disc 3. Overall, this game really did like continue to up the ante for what a game could be and what Final Fantasy could be in this whole genre, really. Whilst it didn't reach the popularity and heights of its predecessor, I still think on a technical front, in terms of its visual fidelity and soundtrack, it continued to push forward and really do a lot in this department. And man, Final Fantasy VIII soundtrack, I still listen to this on like a regular occasion to this day. It is so atmospheric, and it really does sell the environments of this, like the locations of this world, and it is something that this alone is something that I would just recommend the game for. There is this strange beauty I can't help but think about when thinking back on my time with Final Fantasy VIII. There are moments in my playthrough where I was like, yes, this game is really doing it for me. And then other times where I questioned if I even liked the game. It really did pull me both ways at times, and throughout the experience, I was questioning myself always about how I felt. And yet weirdly, I can't stop thinking about it. The thing about Final Fantasy VIII is to me that it really does feel like a game that doesn't immediately scream out for your attention, but it is one that you ponder on long after the journey has concluded. There are some narrative flaws, the junction system and the draw mechanics may not be your favorite, but here you are still thinking about the time you had in this world, the twists and turns, humming the tone of Fishman's Horizon or Laguna's theme and thinking to yourself, yeah, Final Fantasy VIII was a good time. It was a good game. The rabbit hole of theories and interpretations people have made about this game over the years, to me, only adds to another level of what like many of the strengths in 8's dream-like writing is. And honestly, after the success Square had with 7, I'm surprised and ultimately respect the different approach that they took when creating Final Fantasy VIII. There is something beautiful about the whole experience that FF8 offers, from its soundtrack, its world, and whilst its cast may not be as eclectic as Final Fantasy VI or 7, the journey that these characters set out on is one that I'll never really forget. Final Fantasy VIII feels like one of the most ambitious entries in the series, and whilst it does fall short in some areas, I honestly do strongly believe that this game should be the first in line for a remake. Because if they were to touch up and refine the junction system and the draw system, alongside addressing some of the narrative issues, particularly those twists that I mentioned earlier, I do genuinely believe that Final Fantasy VIII would be an experience that'd be a lot less divisive and one that many more people could love. But I think that's kind of the beauty of FF8 as well. Its polarizing nature is something that makes it so special, the fact that it was experimental and different. So as much as I would like a remake, I think maybe the original's beauty shines in the fact of what it actually is. But all around, I think that for all its flaws, I still do think that Final Fantasy VIII was an incredible game, and I have a lot of fondness for it, and even to this day, months after completing it, I still do think about it. And I think that there's a lot of more polished games or games with less flaws that you kind of finish and never really consider, but Final Fantasy VIII is one that sticks around for me. And that brings me to the conclusion for this video. Bringing all of these components together into one clear and concise manner, I would describe Final Fantasy VIII as the most experimental mainline Final Fantasy that Square has developed, and in turn is one of the most polarizing experiences Square has developed. It is an experience that feels like the antithesis of the critical darling that was Final Fantasy VII, providing the junction system that when you go into a deeper system that is a lot more complex than what people were used to with materia, it's served to be a little convoluted. It's something that can be heavily customizable. It's really flexible and has a lot of depth. If you're willing to learn it, it can outright break the game if you are good enough to conquer it, but can be convoluted and a barrier to those who don't understand it. It presents itself as a love story, told through the themes of trauma and the predestination, and despite fumbling some of its major reveals, tells a story full of heart and a very adverse approach to the concepts of fate that many other mainline entries choose to tackle. Final Fantasy VIII is a game that, despite its polarizing and divisive standing amongst the Final Fantasy fandom, is one where I can see the magic that those who love the game see, whilst simultaneously understanding the many missteps that turn off the detractors of the game. Final Fantasy VIII for me is personally an interesting one, where I feel like I really haven't had an experience quite like it, at least for a while. I find the world, its story, and many aspects of the junction system fascinating, while simultaneously feeling like the story takes some missteps that really turn me off from it. And in some ways that it handles its narrative beats, I really am like, why? I don't understand the draw system. I just don't like it. I just don't get why it's frustrating and it's mundane, and I don't like how reliant it is. Either the junction system and the combat are on the draw system. It could be just done differently. But if you were to ask me if I enjoyed my time with the game and if I'd ever play it again, I can tell you right now in a heartbeat, it would undeniably be a yes. Because overall, when you get over the bumps in the road, Final Fantasy VIII is a unique and charming experience that is sure to leave an impression, and it might even surprise you, because despite its shortcomings I've listed, it is one I'm glad I've played and one I feel like I'll remember for years to come. Thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed the video. Leave a comment down below how you feel, whether or not you're in the camp that does like it or doesn't like it. I'm interested to hear your thoughts and hear how you feel about this experience. I'm also curious for people who played it back in the day, how has it aged now with time? Because I've only really played it recently and just been gathering my thoughts on it. So I'm interested to hear different perspectives, and as always, thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed the video. Have a good one.